Welcome to Eternal Darkness, where nightmares come to life. I'll be your host through these twisted tales tonight. Before we descend into the shadows, remember to like and subscribe to join our growing community of horror enthusiasts. Get comfortable, turn down the lights, and prepare yourself as we begin our journey into the unknown. I went to sleep way later than I'd planned, close to midnight, and all I wanted was a few hours of decent rest. The place I call home isn't what you'd consider welcoming after dark. It's perched on a rugged incline, surrounded by these looming trees that block out most light once the sun goes down. Usually I find it peaceful, but that night something felt off. Around 3 a.m, my eyes flew open. At first I couldn't pin down what had jolted me awake. No loud crash, no rattling window, just this sense that I wasn't alone. My throat felt dry, so I slipped out of bed, trying not to make a sound. The hallway was almost pitch black except for a thin shaft of moonlight slicing across the floor. I could have sworn the whole house was holding secrets I didn't want to uncover. By the time I made it to the kitchen, my nerves were jangling. The faucet squeaked, and the water I gulped down tasted stale, like it had been sitting in the pipes too long. Normally I'd check my phone or listen to some late-night show to calm down, but something told me to stay quiet and keep my senses sharp. When I got back to my room, I eased myself onto the edge of the bed and happened to glance out the window. It took a second for my eyes to adjust, but the moon was bright enough to show the outlines of branches stretching at my level, like a haunted walkway suspended in midair. At first, the trees looked empty, just swaying leaves and twisting shapes. But there was a darker form out there that I couldn't explain. It was perched on a thick branch, kind of hunched, yet still taking up a lot of space. That shape was wrong. Too tall, too angular, and definitely watching me. I caught a faint glimmer of red where its eyes should have been, a color that didn't belong in that landscape of silvery moonlight. My pulse pounded in my ears, and I couldn't make sense of what I was looking at. Animal, human, something else entirely. It had this lanky outline, like its limbs stretched out more than they should, and it didn't look the least bit uncomfortable balancing in those branches. I swallowed the lump in my throat and leaned in, trying to convince myself this was just my imagination. But there was no trick of the light here. It was real enough to tighten every muscle in my body, and it was studying me, as though it was used to being the one hidden in the dark, rarely caught off guard. After an agonizing stretch of time that might have only been 10 or 15 seconds, the figure shifted, cocking its head in a way that screamed curiosity, or worse, recognition. I thought about reaching for my phone, calling someone, anyone, but I couldn't bring myself to move. A sick kind of fascination rooted me to the spot. Just as I started to regain some composure, the creature vanished from the branch with a sudden fluid motion. I leapt off the bed and rushed to the window, half expecting to see it sprawled out below. Instead, I glimpsed it weaving through the undergrowth at an unbelievable speed. The brush shook like something massive was forcing a path downhill, heading deeper into the forest's shadows. Even after it disappeared, I stayed frozen at the window, mentally replaying what I'd seen. I couldn't have made it up. It was too vivid, too unsettling. The rest of the night was just me sitting there, lights on, barely blinking. I knew sleep wasn't happening. My mind wouldn't stop racing through 1,000 questions. Was it coming back? Had it been lurking there before? Would it have just watched me if I hadn't noticed it first? When a faint hint of dawn finally crept over the treetops, I still felt pinned in place by that silent encounter. That moonlit glimpse of something beyond normal logic stuck with me. And the most unnerving part? It seemed to know I was there the whole time, as if this was its territory, and I'd stumbled into something I wasn't meant to see. I barely slept a wink after what happened, so I was awake before dawn even had a chance to stretch across the sky. The minute the sunlight finally crept in, I forced myself to peel away from the window. My eyes felt gritty, my head hurt, and my nerves were completely shot, but I needed some kind of proof that last night wasn't a hallucination. When I first looked out at the trees bathed in morning light, it almost felt like the forest itself was mocking me, flaunting its newfound serenity. Gone were the eerie moonlit shadows and that terrifying silhouette. Now everything looked ordinary, like any other stretch of woods on a clear day, but I knew better than to let daylight fool me. After gulping down a cup of coffee, I decided to walk around the perimeter of my property. Honestly, I could have used some extra caffeine or maybe something stronger, but I had to do this while my courage was still high. The sun was surprisingly bright, making me squint as I stepped outside. It's like the world was saying, "See? Nothing to be scared of." I wasn't buying it. My boots crunched over patchy grass as I made my way toward the tree line, scanning every inch of the ground. Part of me felt ridiculous, like I was on a scavenger hunt for footprints or claw marks, but I needed to see something that would confirm what I'd witnessed. I kept noticing snapped twigs, flattened areas in the brush, and places where the pine needles seemed disturbed. Could have been deer. Could have been anything, really. Yet each irregularity made my stomach clench, conjuring images of last night's creature trampling its way through. I ventured deeper into the woods, following what looked like a faint trail. The morning birds had fallen strangely quiet, and that silence heightened my awareness of every snap and rustle underfoot. About 50 yards in, I spotted something that made me stop dead in my tracks. 3 deep gouges carved into the bark of an old oak tree. They were too deliberate to be natural, running parallel to each other at about my eye level. Fresh, too, with sap still oozing from the cuts. My fingertips traced the marks, finding them deeper than I expected. Whatever made these had to be strong, with something sharp enough to slice through thick bark with precision. A hunter's knife? Some kind of tool? But why here? And why in that specific pattern? The marks reminded me of territorial signs, like animals make to warn others away. The thought made my mouth go dry. When I finally got back inside, I realized my hands were shaking. Not from the chill in the air, but from the memory of those glowing red eyes, and now these unexplained markings. I grabbed the nearest notebook and scrawled down every detail. How tall it seemed. That hunched posture. The incredible speed at which it bolted into the undergrowth. The strange claw marks on the tree. My writing was uneven, and ink bled in places where I pressed the pen too hard. Reliving the memory turned my nerves raw all over again. I spent the next hour or two crouched in front of my laptop, diving deep into the darkest corners of cryptid forums. I read about everything from wilderness stalkers to unclassified forest dwellers. None of these descriptions matched exactly what I'd seen, though. I clicked through post after post, scanning for any mention of elongated limbs and glowing eyes perched at tree level. My head started spinning with folklore I'd never heard of, each more bizarre than the last. There was so much nonsense out there, but also just enough plausible detail to keep my paranoia on a steady burn. By early afternoon, I was so anxious that every small noise made me jump. The hum of the refrigerator was suddenly too loud, the tick of the clock too sharp. I'd whip my head toward the window at the slightest hint of motion, half convinced I'd see that tall shape lurking in the high branches. But nothing was there, just swaying leaves and sunlight dancing through the gaps. It felt like the forest was waiting, watching for me to let my guard down. The worst part was this persistent thought worming its way through my brain. Did that thing really see me, or was I intruding on its domain? The question nagged at me so much that by late afternoon, I caught myself pacing the living room, trying to distract myself with half-hearted chores. No luck. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those red eyes staring back. Before I knew it, the sun was dipping below the horizon. Night fell quickly in these woods, and as the daylight drained, my sense of safety went with it. The house felt less like home, and more like a flimsy shelter against something that should never have been this close in the first place. I left every light on, even the porch light, just to keep the darkness at bay. But 100 bright bulbs wouldn't have driven away that uneasy feeling. The house started groaning and creaking as it usually does at night, but now each little sound threatened to send my heart galloping. I settled in by the window with a flashlight in hand, watching the branches turn into spindly silhouettes under the moonlight. My eyes burned from lack of sleep, yet I didn't dare look away for more than a few seconds. Part of me wanted to spot it again, just to be absolutely sure I wasn't losing my mind. Another part of me dreaded the idea it might already be watching, hidden in the leaves, waiting for the right moment to show itself. The possibility of a repeat encounter had me on edge, and I knew a second sighting would confirm that last night was no weird fluke. The clock edged closer to midnight, and still no sign of anything. But the tension in my chest never let up. Deep down, I felt like I was teetering on the edge of an even darker secret, one that might be lurking just beyond my vision. I must have dozed off despite my best efforts because I jerked awake to complete darkness. The power had gone out. My flashlight lay dead on the floor where it had fallen from my grip. The digital clock on my nightstand was blank. Outside, the forest seemed to press closer to the house, no longer held at bay by the artificial light. I fumbled for my phone, fingers clumsy with dread. The screen illuminated, casting a weak blue glow across the room. 3:17 a.m., almost the exact same time as last night's encounter. My skin crawled with goosebumps as I directed the phone's light toward the window. The curtains were open just as I'd left them, but something was different. The glass was fogged in patches as if someone had been breathing on it from outside. I inched closer, heart hammering against my ribs. In the condensation, barely visible until my phone light hit it at the right angle, were finger marks. Long, slender streaks dragged downward through the moisture. I stumbled backward, nearly dropping my phone. Someone, or something, had been at my window while I slept. I grabbed my baseball bat from under the bed and pressed my back against the far wall, scanning every corner of the room. The darkness felt suffocating, hiding potential threats in its depths. A faint scratching sound drew my attention back to the window. It was barely audible, like fingernails lightly dragging across the glass. My throat constricted with terror as I watched new fog appear on the window, spreading outward from a central point as if someone was exhaling against it from the other side. I raised the bat, prepared to swing at anything that might come through. The scratching continued, forming a pattern now. 3 distinct lines drawn vertically down the glass, just like the marks I'd found on the tree, territorial markings. "Who's there?" I shouted, my voice cracking. "I've called the police." The scratching stopped abruptly. For several seconds, nothing happened. Then, a shadow moved across the window. Tall, angular, and unmistakably the same silhouette I'd seen perched in the tree. But this time it was right outside my window, separated from me by nothing but a thin pane of glass. 2 red pinpricks appeared in the darkness. Those same eyes, reflecting what little light came from my phone. They were level with mine, meaning whatever stood out there was well over 6 feet tall. It couldn't be a bear or any other forest animal I knew of. I backed away further, gripping the bat so tightly my knuckles turned white. The shape remained perfectly still, watching me, studying me. Then, without warning, it vanished from view. Not gradually, but in an instant. There 1 second, gone the next. The porch light flickered back on moments later as the power returned. I rushed to every door and window in the house, checking locks, pulling curtains closed. By the time I'd finished securing the house, dawn was breaking again. As the first rays of sunlight pierced through the trees, I collapsed onto the couch, physically and mentally exhausted. By the time the chapter of night ended, I was left with one unshakable truth. I wasn't alone here. This place, the one I'd called home for so long, no longer felt like it belonged entirely to me. Something else was out there, and it seemed more aware of me than I ever wanted it to be. The third day began with a desperate need for answers. I couldn't live like this, jumping at shadows and losing sleep. After forcing down some toast and another cup of strong coffee, I gathered my supplies: a digital camera, my phone, a hunting knife, and a notebook. If this thing was real, I needed evidence. If it wasn't, I needed to prove that to myself before I completely unraveled. I approached the window first, examining it in daylight. The fog marks were gone, evaporated in the morning warmth. But when I looked closer, I noticed something else. Fine scratches in the glass, almost invisible unless the light hit them just right. 3 parallel lines, identical to what I'd seen on the tree. I took several photos, making sure to capture them from different angles. Outside, I found something even more disturbing. Beneath my window, the soil was disturbed. Not footprints exactly, but long, narrow depressions in the dirt, as if something heavy had been dragging itself forward. The pattern was unusual. Not the typical bipedal human gait, but something more deliberate. I photographed these too, placing my hand in the frame for scale. Following these markings led me deeper into the woods than I'd gone yesterday. About 100 yards from the house, I discovered what looked like a makeshift shelter. It wasn't much, just branches leaned against a fallen tree to create a low cave-like space. But it was definitely man-made. My stomach lurched at the realization that someone had been living in these woods, possibly watching my house for days or weeks before I noticed. Inside the crude shelter, I found scraps of food wrappers, a torn piece of what might have been a tarp, and something that made my hand freeze midair as I reached for it, a small electronic device with a red LED light. It looked like some kind of modified trail camera or surveillance equipment, the kind hunters use to track animals, but this one had been altered, its casing removed and wires exposed. I backed away from the shelter, suddenly feeling exposed. Whoever built this wasn't just passing through. They were monitoring something. Monitoring me. The pieces were starting to fit together in a horrifying way. The red eyes I'd seen weren't supernatural. They were the LEDs from surveillance equipment. The strange proportions could be explained by someone wearing dark clothing or a ghillie suit to blend with the trees. This wasn't a creature from the woods. This was a person. A stalker. Someone who had been watching my every move, perhaps for much longer than I realized. I hurried back toward the house, no longer concerned about making noise. With each step, the weight of the situation pressed down harder on my chest. I wasn't dealing with the unknown. I was dealing with something far more dangerous. Human malice. Back at the house, I locked every door and window, then called the local sheriff's office. The deputy who answered sounded skeptical when I explained what I'd found, but promised to send someone out later that afternoon. I didn't mention the figure in the trees or the scratches on my window, just the surveillance equipment and makeshift shelter. Even in my panicked state, I knew how crazy the full story would sound. While waiting for the police, I reviewed the photos I'd taken. In one of them, something caught my eye that I hadn't noticed before. A partial footprint near the edge of the frame. It was elongated and narrow, but definitely human. The tread pattern looked like some kind of specialized boot, maybe military or hunting gear. I tried to remember if I'd seen any unfamiliar vehicles parked along the forest road recently, or if any strangers had been asking about properties in the area. Nothing came to mind, but I'd been so wrapped up in my work for the past few months that I'd barely noticed the outside world. By late afternoon, a sheriff's deputy named Garland finally arrived. He was younger than I expected, probably in his early 30s, with a no-nonsense expression that suggested he'd already decided this was a waste of his time. "So, you found what you think is a homeless camp in the woods?" he asked, not bothering to hide his skepticism. "It's not a homeless camp," I insisted. "There's surveillance equipment. Someone's been watching my house." Deputy Garland sighed but followed me into the woods anyway. When we reached the spot where I'd found the shelter, my heart sank. It was gone. Not just the electronic device, but the entire structure. Branches had been scattered, food wrappers removed, and the ground swept clean of evidence. "There was a shelter right here," I said, my voice rising. "And a camera or something with red lights. It was right here." Garland looked around, clearly unconvinced. "Maybe an animal disturbed it. Bears are active this time of year." "Bears don't clean up after themselves," I snapped. "Someone came back and removed everything after I found it." The deputy made a show of walking around the area, but I could tell he thought I was either paranoid or making it all up. After a cursory examination, he suggested I might want to get some rest and said he'd keep an eye out during his patrols. As he walked back to his cruiser, I showed him the photos I'd taken, including the scratches on my window and the footprint. He glanced at them briefly, remarking that the scratches could be from tree branches in the wind, and the footprint could be anyone's, maybe even my own. "Look, I'm not saying nothing's going on," he said as he got into his car. "But without more concrete evidence, there's not much I can do. Keep your doors locked and call us if you see anyone suspicious." After he left, the forest seemed to close in around me again. Whoever was out there knew I'd found their hideout. They knew I'd called the police. And now they knew the police weren't taking me seriously. I was completely alone. That night, I didn't even attempt to sleep. Instead, I set up my own surveillance system. I positioned my laptop's webcam facing the window and started a recording program. I placed my phone on the opposite side of the room, also recording. Then I settled into a chair in the corner, baseball bat across my lap, and waited. Hours passed with nothing but the gentle hum of electronics and the occasional creak of the house settling. My eyelids grew heavy despite the adrenaline and caffeine. I pinched myself, slapped my cheeks, anything to stay alert. But exhaustion was taking its toll after days with minimal sleep. At 2:43 a.m., the power went out again. Both my laptop and phone continued recording on battery power, but the sudden darkness jolted me back to full awareness. This wasn't a coincidence. Someone had cut the power deliberately. I gripped the bat tighter, straining to hear any sound above my own breathing. For several minutes, nothing happened. Then, so faint I almost missed it, came a scraping noise from the roof. Footsteps moving slowly, deliberately, across the shingles above my head. I froze, eyes darting to the ceiling as I tracked the movement. The footsteps paused directly overhead, and then something much heavier dragged across the roof. A moment later, there was a thud against the side of the house, followed by scratching at my window. The same three-line pattern as before. My phone and laptop were still recording, capturing whatever was happening, but I couldn't see the window from my position without exposing myself. I had to decide, stay hidden or confront whatever was out there. The scratching continued, more insistent now. Then a new sound. Something metallic working against the window latch from the outside. They were trying to get in. I launched from my chair, bat raised high, and charged toward the window with a primal scream. In the dim glow from my devices, I caught a glimpse of a face pressed against the glass. Gaunt, with sunken features partially obscured by what looked like dark paint or mud. The eyes reflected red from my laptop screen, giving them that eerie glow I'd seen before. The face vanished the instant I moved, dropping away from the window with inhuman speed. I heard scrambling on the roof again, then silence. My heart pounded so hard I could barely hear anything else. I fumbled for my flashlight, hands shaking violently, and directed the beam outside. Nothing. Just the empty branches swaying in the night breeze. I checked both my recording devices immediately. The laptop had captured something. A dark shape at the window, the scratching sounds clearly audible. But the face was mostly in shadow, impossible to identify. My phone had a better angle, but the image was too grainy in the low light to make out details. Still, it was evidence. Proof I wasn't imagining things. I saved both recordings to multiple locations, including emailing them to myself. If anything happened to me, there would be a record. The power remained off until morning. I sat vigil by the window, bat in hand, until the first light of dawn painted the trees in shades of gold and orange. Only then did I allow myself to slump against the wall, physically and emotionally drained. With daylight came a new determination. I couldn't live like this, waiting for night after night of terror. I needed to understand what I was dealing with. Who was this person? What did they want from me? Why had they chosen my home to torment? I reviewed the recordings again, this time on my phone since the laptop battery had died. Adjusting the brightness and contrast, I noticed something I'd missed before. A reflection in the window glass showed a portion of what the intruder was wearing. It looked like some kind of specialized outfit with straps and pockets, almost like tactical gear. This wasn't random harassment. This was methodical, planned. The person knew exactly what they were doing and had the equipment to do it effectively. But why target me? I wasn't wealthy. I didn't have enemies. I lived a quiet, solitary life by choice, rarely interacting with others beyond necessary transactions. Unless, that was exactly why I'd been chosen. Isolated. Vulnerable. Unlikely to be believed if I reported strange occurrences. The perfect victim. The thought chilled me more deeply than any supernatural explanation could have. Human predators are infinitely more terrifying than forest monsters because they choose to inflict fear. They enjoy it. As morning progressed, I made two decisions. First, I wouldn't flee. That might be exactly what they wanted, to drive me from my home. Second, I would prepare for confrontation. If this person wanted to play psychological games, they'd picked the wrong target. I refused to be terrorized any longer. I spent the day securing the house, boarding windows, reinforcing door locks, and setting up makeshift alarms using string and cans at entry points. I charged my devices and positioned cameras at strategic locations. Then I loaded my grandfather's old hunting rifle, something I hadn't touched in years. By sunset, my home resembled a fortress. I was exhausted, but resolute. Let them come, I thought. I'm ready. Night fell with excruciating slowness, each tick of the clock bringing me closer to the inevitable confrontation. I positioned myself in the living room, rifle within reach but not in hand. I didn't want to accidentally shoot at shadows. My goal wasn't to harm, but to capture, to finally see the face of my tormentor and understand why this was happening. This time, I didn't turn on any lights. Let them think I was asleep or had fled. Let them grow confident enough to make a mistake. The hours crawled by. 11 p.m. Midnight. 1 a.m. Nothing. The forest remained eerily silent, as if holding its breath along with me. By 2 a.m., I began to wonder if they had somehow sensed my preparations and stayed away. At 2:38 a.m., one of my alarms triggered, cans clattering near the back door. I remained perfectly still, eyes fixed on the hallway leading to the kitchen. Another sound followed. The subtle creak of a floorboard that I knew was loose near the back entrance. They were inside my house. My mouth went dry and sweat beaded on my forehead despite the cool night air. I silently reached for the rifle, careful not to make any sudden movements. The footsteps were almost imperceptible, but I could track their progress through the kitchen, pausing occasionally as if listening for my location. I had positioned a small mirror on the coffee table that gave me a partial view of the hallway. In its reflection, I caught a glimpse of movement, a tall, slender figure sliding along the wall with practiced precision. They wore dark clothing with multiple pockets and something over their face. Not quite a mask, but some kind of camouflage paint that distorted their features. In one hand, they held what looked like a hunting knife. In the other, some kind of small device with a red indicator light, similar to what I'd found in the woods. They paused at the hallway entrance, scanning the living room. I remained frozen in place, barely breathing. For a heart-stopping moment, I thought they'd spotted me in the darkness, but then they turned toward the stairs, apparently planning to check the bedrooms first. This was my chance. As they placed a foot on the first stair, I flipped on the lights and raised the rifle. "Don't move," I commanded, surprised by the steadiness in my voice. "Put the knife down." The figure froze, then slowly turned to face me. Up close, they were even more disturbing than I'd imagined. Tall and gaunt, with dark camouflage paint applied in a pattern that broke up the human outline of their face. The eyes that had appeared red in the darkness were actually pale blue, almost colorless and utterly cold. "Who are you?" I demanded. "Why are you doing this?" For several seconds they said nothing, just stared at me with those empty eyes. Then, slowly, a smile spread across their face. Not a normal expression of amusement, but something predatory and wrong. "You weren't supposed to see me," they said, voice raspy as if rarely used. "Not that first night. No one ever sees me." "What do you want from me?" I kept the rifle steady, though my hands had started to shake. "Want?" They tilted their head, the same curious gesture I'd seen that first night in the tree. "I don't want anything from you. You're just interesting, living alone, always watching the forest but never seeing what's in it. Until you did." A chill ran through me as I realized the implications. This person had been observing me for much longer than just these few days. They'd been in my woods, watching my habits, my routines, perhaps for months. "How long?" I managed to ask. "Since winter," they replied, as casually as if discussing the weather. "You never lock your back door before 9. You sleep with the window open when it's above 60 degrees. You talk to yourself when you think no one's listening." My stomach lurched. The intimate knowledge of my life, revealed so matter-of-factly, was more violating than any physical threat. "You're sick," I said, anger replacing fear. "The police are on their way." It was a lie, but I needed to establish some control. They laughed, a dry, hollow sound. "No, they're not. You tried that yesterday. Deputy Garland, right? He didn't believe you." "I have recordings," I countered, "from last night. Your face at my window, the scratches, everything." For the first time, uncertainty flickered across their features. "Recordings?" "On multiple devices, already uploaded to the cloud. If anything happens to me, they'll know exactly who to look for." The intruder's eyes darted around the room, likely searching for the devices I'd mentioned. Their grip on the knife tightened. "You should have just pretended not to see," they said, voice hardening. "Everyone else does. They convince themselves it was a deer or a shadow. They lock their doors and tell themselves they're safe. But you kept looking, kept searching." "Because this is my home," I said firmly. "Not yours. You don't belong here." "I belong everywhere people don't look," they countered. "The spaces between attention, the blind spots. I've watched dozens of homes, dozens of lives. Most never even know." The confession sent ice through my veins. This wasn't just about me. This person was a serial stalker, possibly worse. How many others had they terrorized? How many had simply explained away the signs as I nearly had? "Put down the knife," I repeated. "This ends tonight." For a moment I thought they might comply. Their shoulders sagged slightly and the knife lowered an inch. Then with startling speed they flicked something from their pocket toward me. I flinched instinctively, and in that split second they lunged, not at me, but toward the front door. I fired the rifle, aiming high to avoid hitting them directly. The shot splintered the doorframe, stopping them in their tracks. They whirled back toward me, eyes wide with something like respect. "You actually fired," they said, sounding almost impressed. Most people can't. Next one won't miss, I warned, though the thought of actually shooting another human being made me nauseated. We stood in stalemate, eyes locked, neither willing to make the next move. Outside, an owl hooted, breaking the silence. The intruder's gaze flicked to the window, then back to me. They'll come looking when they hear the shot, I said. Neighbors, police, you can't disappear this time. A strange expression crossed their face. Not fear exactly, but something close to disappointment. I chose wrong with you, they said softly. Too observant. Too stubborn. Why me? I had to know. Out of everyone, why pick my house? They shrugged, a disconcertingly normal gesture from such an abnormal presence. You were always watching the forest. I wanted to see what would happen if the forest watched back. The answer was so simple, so devoid of complex motive, that it terrified me more than any elaborate scheme would have. I'd been tormented not out of revenge or desire, but mere curiosity, the casual cruelty of someone who viewed other lives as entertainment. Distant sirens began to wail, growing louder by the second. Someone had indeed heard the gunshot and called it in. The intruder's posture changed immediately, tension replacing the eerie calm. Without warning, they flung the knife at the ceiling light, plunging the room into darkness. I fired again reflexively, but hit nothing. By the time my eyes adjusted, the front door was open, and they were gone. I rushed to the doorway, rifle at the ready, but saw only empty darkness. The sirens were close now, less than a minute away. Red and blue lights began to flash among the trees as patrol cars approached. As officers swarmed my property minutes later, I stood in the doorway, physically present but mentally still locked in that moment of confrontation. I'd seen the face of what had been haunting me. Not a creature, not a monster, but something far more disturbing. A human who had chosen to become a predator, hunting not for food or survival, but for the pleasure of causing fear. The next few days passed in a blur of police statements, evidence collection, and sleepless nights. This time, with physical evidence, the knife left behind, damage from the gunshot, and most importantly, my recordings. The authorities took me seriously. Deputy Garland had been replaced by a detective named Holloway, a stern-faced woman who specialized in stalking cases. Based on what you've described and the evidence we've collected, we believe your intruder fits the profile of what we call a watcher, she explained, as we sat at my kitchen table the morning after the confrontation. They're a rare but documented type of stalker who derive satisfaction primarily from observation rather than direct contact. So this person watches people? That's it? I asked, struggling to comprehend the motive. Not exactly, Holloway replied, her expression grim. Watchers typically progress through stages. First observation from a distance, then closer surveillance, then testing boundaries, like the scratches on your window and the power outages. When their victims notice them, they usually move on to a new target. You forced an escalation by actively seeking them out and confronting them. So this is my fault? I couldn't keep the bitterness from my voice. Absolutely not, she said firmly. What you did was brave, and it's given us our first solid lead on someone who may be responsible for dozens of similar cases across 3 counties. She showed me a map marked with red pins, locations where people had reported strange sightings, unexplained surveillance, and home invasions that matched the pattern of my experience. Most had been dismissed as paranoia or wildlife encounters, just as mine nearly was. We found prints on the knife, Holloway continued. No match in our system yet, but we're expanding the search. The boot prints outside match a specialized type used by wildlife photographers and hunters, designed to leave minimal impact on terrain. I nodded, remembering the strange gait and the equipment I'd seen. They said they'd been watching people for a long time, that most never noticed. That tracks with what we know about this type of predator, she confirmed. They're patient, Methodical. They consider themselves invisible, and when someone sees them, it challenges their self-image. That's what makes them dangerous. Do you think they'll come back? The question had been haunting me since that night. Holloway didn't sugarcoat her answer. It's possible. Their pattern has been disrupted. Some move on when that happens, but others become fixated on the person who saw them. We're keeping officers in the area, and I'd strongly recommend you stay with friends or family for a while. The thought of abandoning my home felt like surrender, but practicality won out. I arranged to stay with my cousin in the city, 40 miles away. Before leaving, I installed proper security cameras, motion sensor lights, and a monitored alarm system. The woods that had once seemed peaceful now felt like they harbored secrets I could never unsee. As I packed a suitcase, Detective Holloway helped me secure the house. She paused by the window where I'd first seen the figure in the tree. You know, most people in your situation would have convinced themselves they imagined it all, she said. That's what these predators count on, our ability to rationalize away the inexplicable. I almost did, I admitted, if I hadn't seen those marks on the tree the next day. But you didn't stop looking, she pointed out. That's what saved you, and potentially others. Her words offered little comfort as I took one last look at my home before leaving. The trees stood silent and watching, just as they always had. But now I knew that sometimes the forest really does watch back. 6 months have passed since my encounter in the woods. I've returned to my house, though not without changes. The security system remains, upgraded and expanded. I've cleared the trees nearest to the house, eliminating any branches that could provide access to my windows. Motion sensor lights illuminate the property at the slightest disturbance. Detective Holloway calls me every few weeks with updates. The fingerprints eventually matched those found at 3 other scenes across the state. All homes isolated near forests, all belonging to people who lived alone. They've compiled a profile of the suspect. Likely male, 30-45 years old, with extensive outdoor and surveillance experience, possibly with military or law enforcement background. Still at large. Sometimes on quiet nights when the wind moves through the remaining trees, I find myself standing at that same window, peering into the darkness. Not out of fear, but vigilance. The experience has changed me in ways I'm still understanding. I notice things now. Subtle patterns, disturbances, the feeling of being observed. Awareness has become both my burden and my shield. I've connected with the other victims through a support group Holloway recommended. We share a unique trauma, the violation not just of our homes, but of our perception of safety. Most had dismissed their experiences as imagination or paranoia until I came forward with evidence. Now they too are reclaiming their stories, their spaces, their right to be believed. Last week, while hiking a trail near my property, something I've only recently found the courage to do again, I noticed 3 fresh scratches on a tree just off the path. The same pattern I'd seen before. My heart raced, but I didn't run. Instead, I photographed the marks and sent them to Holloway. Then I continued my hike, eyes alert, senses heightened. The forest doesn't frighten me the way it once did. I understand now that the true horror wasn't in what I saw in those trees that night. It was in the years I spent not seeing, not noticing the predator who had made my woods their hunting ground. The blindness we cultivate to maintain our comfort is perhaps our greatest vulnerability. Sometimes I think I catch glimpses of movement among distant trees, a tall figure sliding between trunks, watching from the shadows. It could be imagination, memory playing tricks, or it could be real. Either way, I no longer look away. I stare directly back, because I know the truth now. The watcher in the trees never truly leaves. They merely retreat, regroup, find new vantage points, new victims. The game continues, but the rules have changed. They are no longer the only ones watching. I've installed cameras facing the forest, not just for security, but documentation. If they return, when they return, there will be no question of evidence this time. No dismissal as paranoia or wildlife. The predator who thought themselves invisible will discover what it means to be truly seen. In my darkest moments, I wonder if I've become something of a watcher myself. Hyper-vigilant, always scanning the tree line, recording, documenting. The line between hunter and hunted sometimes blurs in my mind. But there's a crucial difference. I watch to protect, not to terrorize. The most unsettling revelation wasn't the existence of such predators among us. It was how effectively they operate within the spaces we choose not to see. Our blind spots, our comfortable denials, the gaps in attention where we tell ourselves that odd sound was just the house settling, that movement just a trick of light. God help me. But sometimes in my dreams, I see those cold, pale eyes staring at me through my window, and I feel an unsettling kinship. Not with the cruelty or the violation, but with the patience, the attention to detail, the understanding that most people miss what's right in front of them. I keep these thoughts to myself during therapy sessions. Some transformations are too complex to articulate, too unnerving to share. Instead, I focus on recovery, on rebuilding, on the practical steps towards safety and normalcy. But I know, and perhaps they know, that normalcy is a fiction we maintain. The comfortable blindness is gone forever. I will never again dismiss that crawling sensation of being watched as mere imagination. Never rationalize away evidence that something is wrong. Never choose comfortable denial over uncomfortable vigilance. The trees outside my window still stand, swaying in the night breeze just as they always have. Beautiful in daylight, ominous after dark. But now I understand what they've been trying to tell me all along. There are spaces between what we choose to see and what exists. Shadows that move when we look away. Watchers who count on our willingness to explain away the inexplicable. I leave my curtains open now. Let them see that I am not afraid, that I remain alert, that this territory is no longer unguarded. The watcher chose me because I was already watching the forest. They wanted to see what would happen if the forest watched back. Now they know. The decision to escape into wilderness rarely comes from contentment. It was October 2017 when the concrete and chaos of Seattle finally broke something in me. After 12 years at Hartwick Publishing, I'd been restructured out of my senior editor position. My marriage had dissolved 2 years prior, and the apartment walls seemed to close in a little more each day. So when I found myself browsing used RVs online at 3 a.m., it felt less like impulse and more like survival. 3 weeks later, I was behind the wheel of a 2005 Winnebago Mini, headed northeast toward Glacier National Park in Montana. The vehicle, which I'd named Ernest after Hemingway's Pursuit of Solitude, had seen better days, but it ran well enough. The previous owner, a retired park ranger with arthritic hands and honest eyes, had maintained it meticulously. Glacier in autumn, he'd said while signing over the title. Smart man. Tourists gone. Bears getting sluggish before hibernation. Just watch the weather. Mountains don't forgive poor planning. I had nodded sagely, as though I weren't a 42-year-old publishing professional whose outdoor experience consisted mainly of reading Jack London in comfortable chairs. The truth was, I'd chosen Glacier because a travel magazine in our waiting room had featured it. The photographs of pristine lakes and towering pines promising the kind of isolation that might let me hear myself think again. The drive took 3 days, with stops at roadside motels where I practiced using Ernest's facilities without the embarrassment of an audience. By the time I reached the western entrance of the park, something in my chest had already loosened. The October air had teeth, but the kind that woke you rather than wounded. "Just you?" asked the ranger at the entrance station, a woman with silver-threaded hair and sun-weathered skin. "Just me," I confirmed, handing over my credit card for the entrance fee. She studied me for a moment. "Most of the campgrounds are closed for the season. Apgar's open, but it'll be pretty empty. You looking for solitude or safety?" "Both, if possible." She smiled then, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. "Stay on marked trails, carry bear spray, and check in with rangers when you can. Some areas up north have had issues recently." "Issues?" "Probably nothing. Some vandalism, a few hikers reporting equipment missing." She handed back my card. "Just keep your wits about you. Cell service is spotty at best." I thanked her and drove into the park, Ernest's engine straining slightly on the inclines. The asphalt road curved around mountains and valleys that seemed to exist in defiance of human intrusion. Lake McDonald appeared around a bend, its surface mirroring the surrounding pines with such perfection it was difficult to see where reality ended and reflection began. I bypassed the nearly empty Apgar campground, remembering a spot the previous Winnebago owner had marked on my map, a dispersed camping area near the northern edge of Lake McDonald. "Legal but overlooked," he'd said. "Most folks don't know about it." The service road leading there was rutted and narrow, making Ernest creak in protest as we bounced along. When the trees finally opened to reveal a small clearing about 50 yards from the lakeshore, I felt a surge of triumph. The spot was perfect, a flat area large enough for the RV with a crude fire pit ringed by stones, and a view of the lake through a natural frame of pines. I spent the afternoon setting up camp, arranging my portable chair to face the water and gathering deadfall for a fire. The silence was so complete I could hear the lap of water against the distant shore. No car horns, no neighbors arguing through thin walls, no phones ringing with bad news from HR. Just the occasional whisper of wind through pine needles and the startled cry of a bird. As the sun began to set, casting the mountains in shades of amber and rose, I lit the fire and poured myself 2 fingers of bourbon. For the first time in months, my shoulders relaxed away from my ears. The peace lasted exactly 18 minutes. The growl of an engine shattered the silence, growing louder until a battered Ford pickup emerged from the service road. It slowed as it approached my campsite, its tires crunching on pine needles and gravel. The driver, visible through a windshield smudged with dust and insect remains, was a man with a beard so wild and unkempt it seemed to be consuming his face. Beneath a filthy trucker cap, his eyes fixed on me with an intensity that locked my limbs in place. The truck stopped. For what felt like minutes but was likely seconds, we stared at each other across 30 feet of forest floor. I raised my hand in what I hoped was a friendly but not overly familiar wave. The gesture seemed to trigger something in him. He leaned his head out the window, spat a stream of brown liquid onto the ground, and then fixed me with a look so nakedly hostile that I felt it like a physical blow. "You're on private property," he called, his voice a gravel-filled rasp. I stood, trying to project confidence. "Actually, I checked with the Park Service. This is a dispersed camping area, part of Glacier National Park." Something dark shifted across his features. "Map's wrong. Always been wrong." His eyes flicked to Ernest, then to my camp chair, the fire, and the bourbon. This land was never theirs to give. Before I could respond, he put the truck in gear and continued down the service road, his taillights vanishing around a bend. I sat back down, my hands trembling slightly as I raised the bourbon to my lips. The encounter had lasted less than a minute, but it had punched a hole in my carefully constructed bubble of solitude. I considered packing up and moving to the official campground, but something stubborn in me resisted. This was public land. I had as much right to be here as anyone. As darkness settled fully over the lake, I built up the fire and tried to recapture the peace I'd felt earlier. The flames cast dancing shadows against the trees, creating a small circle of light that seemed increasingly fragile against the pressing dark of the forest. I was about to turn in when I heard it. A crack of branches from somewhere in the tree line behind my campsite. I stood, flashlight in hand, and swept the beam across the wall of pines. "Hello?" My voice sounded thin against the vastness. "Anyone there?" No response came, but as I stood listening, the hairs on my arms prickled upward. The feeling of being watched was so tangible I could almost touch it. I played the flashlight across the trees again, the beam catching momentarily on something that might have been eyes reflecting the light, before whatever it was ducked away. "Probably just a deer," I muttered, but I didn't believe it. Deer don't watch you with purpose. That night, in Ernest's narrow bed, I dreamed of bearded men who emerged from trees as though they were made of bark and sap themselves, their eyes hollow and hungry. I woke repeatedly, certain I'd heard footsteps circling the RV, but when I peered through the blinds, I saw only moonlight casting blue shadows across empty ground. Dawn arrived with merciful brightness, banishing the night's imaginings. Over breakfast, instant coffee, and a granola bar, I planned a day hike to clear my head. According to my map, a trail began just a quarter-mile up the service road, leading to several pristine alpine lakes. As I laced up my barely used hiking boots, I glanced toward the spot where the truck had stopped yesterday. In the morning light, I could now see something I'd missed. Tire tracks, not just from yesterday, but many sets overlapping, suggesting the bearded man had driven through here regularly. Why would anyone repeatedly drive down a service road that led only to an unused camping spot and the lakeshore? I shouldered my day pack, locked Ernest, and set off up the road, firmly pushing the question away. I was here for peace, not mysteries. But as I hiked deeper into the forest, away from the relative safety of my campsite, I couldn't shake the feeling that the trees themselves were keeping watch, reporting my movements to someone, or something, that considered my presence an intrusion. Whatever solitude had promised, it was beginning to feel like a threat. The trail began innocuously enough, a subtle parting of undergrowth marked by a weather-beaten wooden sign declaring Clearwater Basin, 3.8 miles. The path was overgrown in places, suggesting it saw little traffic this late in the season. Pine needles cushioned my steps as I moved deeper into the forest, the morning sunlight filtering through the canopy in dusty, slanting beams. I'd been hiking for perhaps an hour, sweat dampening my shirt despite the cool air, when I noticed the silence. Not the peaceful absence of urban noise I'd sought, but something oppressive. The birds had stopped singing. The constant rustle of small creatures in the underbrush had ceased. Even the wind seemed to have died, leaving the trees unnaturally still. I paused, water bottle halfway to my lips, straining to hear anything beyond my own breathing. Nothing. Just the dull thud of my pulse in my ears. "Hello?" I called, immediately regretting it. My voice sounded wrong, too loud, too human in the watching forest. Taking a deep breath, I continued up the trail, now moving more cautiously. The silence persisted for another quarter-mile before abruptly shattering. A raven's harsh cry directly overhead sent my heart leaping into my throat. It took flight from a branch, dark wings catching the light as it circled once and flew ahead along the trail, as if beckoning. I rounded a bend and stopped so abruptly I nearly lost my balance. Ahead, in a small clearing just off the trail, was a campsite. Or rather, what remained of one. A dome tent lay collapsed, the fabric shredded as though clawed by something with immense strength. The tier patterns were long and parallel, not the work of a knife or any tool I could imagine. Around the tent, the ground was churned up, the dirt and pine needles disturbed in a way that suggested violent struggle. Personal belongings were scattered in a 15-foot radius. A camp stove bent at an impossible angle, clothing shredded like the tent, a hiking boot lying on its side with the laces still tied. But it was the stains that froze the breath in my lungs. Dark, rust-colored splashes and smears on the tent fabric. More disturbing were the drag marks leading from the center of the site into the dense undergrowth beyond. Long, continuous smears in the dirt accompanied by more of the dark stains. I pulled out my phone reflexively, but as the ranger had warned, there was no signal. My finger hovered over the emergency call button anyway. Sometimes those would go through even without service. But I hesitated. This was clearly a crime scene. Someone, or several someones, had met with violence here. The rational course of action was to return to the ranger station and report what I'd found. But something compelled me to look closer, to try to understand what had happened before I left. Stepping carefully to avoid disturbing potential evidence, I moved toward the tent. The destruction was even more shocking up close. Whatever had torn through the fabric had done so with enough force to snap one of the fiberglass tent poles. I peered through the largest rent in the material and saw a sleeping bag, also torn, and beside it, a small journal with a leather cover. I reached in and carefully extracted the journal, feeling a twinge of guilt at disturbing the scene, but reasoning that it might contain information about the tent's occupant. The first page had a name and emergency contact. Elise Warner. In case of emergency contact, David Warner. Brother. 400-6-555. Year 178. The most recent entry was dated 3 days ago. Day 4 at Clearwater. Still no sign of Eric or his campsite. Rangers say they have no record of him checking in, but the text he sent me had coordinates to meet up. I'm giving it one more day before heading back to report him missing proper. Last night the noises were back, closer this time. Not animal sounds, but not quite human either. Like someone trying to mimic speech underwater. The ranger said there are no bears in this specific area right now, but something is definitely out there. Setting up my camera trap tonight. I flipped through the rest of the journal, but there were no more entries. I pocketed it, promising myself I'd turn it over to authorities. Eric Sullivan, the name from the backpack I hadn't yet found, was mentioned here. This was clearly connected to something larger than one ransacked campsite. As I straightened, something caught my eye near where the drag marks began. A small digital camera, its lens cracked but the body intact. I picked it up, turned it on, and was surprised to see it still had power. The most recent images were from night mode, triggered by motion. The first showed nothing but darkened trees. The second, time-stamped 2:17 a.m., made my blood run cold. The image quality was poor, but it clearly showed a figure at the edge of the campsite. Tall, unnaturally so, with proportions that seemed wrong, limbs too long, torso too narrow. It was partially hidden behind a tree, but what was visible didn't look fully human. The face was obscured by what might have been a beard, but in the infrared lighting, it appeared more like tendrils or roots growing from the jaw. Most disturbing were the eyes, which reflected the camera's flash as two perfect white circles, devoid of pupils or irises. The third and final image was blurred, as if the camera had been knocked over while firing. All it showed was a smear of movement and what might have been a hand or claw reaching toward the lens. I nearly dropped the camera, a wave of cold fear washing over me. Whatever was in that image wasn't a man in a costume or a bear on its hind legs. It was something else entirely, something that didn't belong in any rational understanding of the world. I backed away from the campsite, my earlier academic interest replaced by primal fear. As I turned to hurry back down the trail, something caught my boot, a strap protruding from beneath a fallen branch. I nearly left it, but curiosity overrode fear for a moment. I lifted the branch to reveal a backpack, partially covered in dirt and pine needles, as if someone had made a hasty attempt to conceal it. The pack was high-end, the kind serious hikers invested in. I unzipped the main compartment with shaking hands. Inside were clothes, a water filter, energy bars, and a wallet. The driver's license inside belonged to Eric Sullivan, a 28-year-old from Spokane. The photo showed a bearded young man with friendly eyes and a wide smile. There was also a folded map with coordinates marked in red pen, presumably the ones mentioned in Elise's journal. Something else was in the backpack, a small leather-bound book similar to Elise's journal. Eric's entries detailed his arrival at Glacier 10 days ago and his plan to meet up with his friend Elise to explore some off-trail features he'd read about online. The final entry sent ice through my veins. I'm being followed. Not by rangers or other hikers, something else. It moves at night mostly, but today I saw it watching me from the trees during daylight. Looks like a man from a distance, but up close. Not quite right. Too tall. Moves wrong. Face isn't a face. Ranger McAllister said I was imagining things, that there's nothing in these woods except wildlife and the occasional hiker. But then he asked why I was in this specific area, got real intense about it. Said this section was prone to landslides, should be avoided. But my maps don't show any danger. Tonight I'm moving camp closer to the meeting point. Elise should be there in 2-3 days. Safety in numbers. McAllister. The name triggered a connection. Harold McAllister. Could that be the bearded man in the truck? The hostile local who claimed the parkland was private property. A rustling sound from the underbrush snapped me back to the present. I spun toward the noise, heart hammering. "Hello?" I called, my voice cracking slightly. "Park ranger?" The rustling stopped immediately. Then came a sound that turned my limbs to water, a low, gurgling vocalization, like someone trying to speak with a throat full of liquid. It rose in pitch, becoming almost questioning, mimicking my intonation with uncanny precision. "Park ranger." I didn't wait to see what emerged. Clutching Eric's backpack and the camera, I ran. The trail seemed longer on the return journey, each bend revealing only more forest, more places for something to hide and watch. Branches whipped my face as I stumbled downhill, my lungs burning, the weight of what I'd discovered heavier than the physical items I carried. Multiple times I thought I heard something moving parallel to me through the trees, keeping pace effortlessly. Once, through a gap in the pines, I caught a glimpse of something tall and wrong-shaped, moving with a smooth gliding motion no human could replicate. When Ernest finally came into view through the trees, I nearly wept with relief. I fumbled with the keys, dropped them, snatched them up again, and finally managed to unlock the door. Once inside, I locked it behind me, drew all the blinds, and collapsed onto the small sofa, gasping for breath. For several minutes, I just sat there, trying to make sense of what I'd seen. The ransacked campsite could be explained by a bear attack. The weird figure in the photo could be a camera malfunction or trick of light. But the journals, the disappearances, the hostile local named McAllister, the mimicking voice in the woods, together they painted a picture too disturbing to rationalize away. I needed to leave. Now. Report everything to the authorities from a safe distance. I moved to the driver's seat and turned the key. Ernest's engine coughed to life, a comforting mechanical sound in the wilderness silence. As I prepared to put him in reverse, movement caught my eye. Standing at the edge of the clearing was the bearded man from the truck. Harold McAllister, I presumed. He wasn't moving toward me, just watching, his stance unnervingly still. And behind him, half hidden among the trees, stood something else. Something taller, its proportions subtly wrong, its face obscured by shadow, except for two pale eyes reflecting the afternoon light. I slammed Ernest into reverse and hit the gas. Ernest's tires spun in the soft earth before finding purchase. I backed onto the service road with more haste than skill, narrowly missing a tree. In the side mirror, I caught a final glimpse of Harold still standing motionless at the edge of the clearing, the taller figure no longer visible behind him. My hands shook on the steering wheel as I navigated the rutted road. The rational part of my mind, the part that had edited thousands of manuscripts, that paid taxes and remembered dental appointments, was trying desperately to impose order on what I'd witnessed. Bears explained the ransacked campsite. A hostile local with possible mental health issues, explained Harold. Camera malfunctions explained the strange images. Stress and suggestion explained the voice in the woods. But the greater part of me, the primitive brain that recognizes danger before consciousness can name it, knew better. Something was deeply wrong in this corner of Glacier National Park, something beyond the usual risks of wilderness. I reached the main park road and turned toward the west entrance, where I'd seen the ranger station. Ernest groaned as I pushed him faster than his aged chassis preferred. The dashboard clock read 3:17 p.m. If I drove straight through, I could reach the ranger station before they closed at 5:00. 10 minutes into the drive, Ernest's engine made a sound no engine should ever make. A high-pitched whine followed by a series of metallic pops. The temperature gauge, which I'd neglected to check in my panic, was deep in the red. Steam billowed from under the hood, and the steering suddenly went heavy in my hands. No, I muttered, guiding the dying vehicle to the shoulder. When the engine finally gave out completely, I was still miles from the ranger station, on a stretch of road with no other vehicles in sight. Pine trees pressed close on both sides, their shadows already lengthening as afternoon began its slide toward evening. I tried my phone again. Still no service. I had passed an emergency call box a few miles back, but the prospect of walking there, with the forest watching, sent ice through my veins. Gathering my courage, I stepped outside to check under Ernest's hood. A plume of steam greeted me, along with the acrid smell of burnt coolant. The radiator had a visible crack, leaking fluorescent green liquid onto the asphalt. Perfect, I said to no one. Just perfect. I gathered essential supplies into my day pack: water, protein bars, the journals, the camera, my pocket knife, and a small can of bear spray I'd bought as an afterthought. For a moment I considered waiting for another vehicle to pass, but the rapidly dimming light changed my mind. Better to start walking now and flag someone down if they appeared. The walk back toward the ranger station was an exercise in controlled terror. Every snapping twig, every rustle in the underbrush sent my heart rate spiking. Twice I thought I heard the rumble of an approaching vehicle, only to turn and see empty roads stretching behind me. After about a mile, the call box came into view, a small metal box on a post with the reassuring Park Service logo. I jogged the last 100 yards, already rehearsing what I'd say to the dispatcher. The call box had been vandalized. The receiver was torn completely from its cord, the metal casing dented as if struck repeatedly with something heavy. Most disturbing was what had been scratched into the metal. Not their land. I backed away, my last hope of easy rescue evaporating. The setting sun cast long shadows across the road, and for the first time, I had to confront the possibility of being in these woods after dark. A new sound reached me then. The distant but unmistakable growl of an engine. I turned toward it, ready to flag down whatever vehicle appeared. Hiker etiquette be damned. Around the bend came the battered Ford pickup. I dove into the trees before conscious thought could form, instinct driving me away from the road and into the concealing underbrush. The truck slowed as it approached the disabled Winnebago, then stopped. Through gaps in the foliage, I watched Harold exit the vehicle and walk around Ernest with the methodical precision of someone looking for tracks. He paused at the call box, running his fingers over the scratched message as if confirming it was still there. Then, most chillingly, he turned toward the exact spot where I'd entered the forest and stood perfectly still, head slightly cocked, like a predator sensing prey. "I know you're watching," he called, his voice carrying easily through the quiet woods. "You think you're the first to come looking? To stick your nose where it doesn't belong?" He walked to the tree line, stopping just feet from where I crouched behind a fallen log. This was McAllister land for 6 generations before the government stole it. My grandfather fought them in court. My father fought them with petitions and protests. I tried fighting them with reason. A bitter laugh escaped him. None of it worked, so I found another way. He turned back toward his truck, and for a moment I thought he might leave. Instead, he reached into the bed and withdrew something that made my blood freeze. A hunting rifle, which he cradled with casual familiarity. The others were accidents, mostly. Got too close to things they shouldn't have seen. But you... He chambered around with practiced ease. You took evidence. The journals. The camera. Can't have that getting out. I pressed myself flatter against the forest floor, hardly daring to breathe. Harold stood at the edge of the trees, rifle ready, scanning the underbrush. The light was fading rapidly now, the forest dissolving into a collage of deepening shadows. "You've got 2 choices," he called. "Come out now, hand over what you took, and I'll drive you to the park boundary. Or stay hidden and deal with what comes after dark. Trust me, you'd prefer the first option." The implied threat was clear, but something in his tone caught my attention. Not just menace, but genuine fear when he mentioned what comes after dark. The image from Elise's camera flashed in my mind. The too tall figure with the wrong proportions and reflective eyes. I remained motionless, barely breathing, as Harold waited for a response that wouldn't come. After what felt like an eternity, he sighed. "Your funeral," he muttered, just loud enough for me to hear. Then, louder, "They're all yours, like we agreed." He returned to his truck, placed the rifle inside, and drove away, leaving me alone in the rapidly darkening forest. For several minutes after his departure, I remained frozen in place, uncertain whether this was a trick to flush me out. When no further sounds came, I cautiously raised my head above the log. The road was empty, Ernest's white bulk clearly visible in the fading light. My options were limited. Return to the RV and hope someone else drove by. Or continue through the forest toward where I believed the ranger station to be. The decision was made for me when I heard it. That same wet, gurgling vocalization from the woods earlier, but now behind me, deeper in the forest. Then another answered from my right and a third from somewhere ahead. They were surrounding me. I broke cover and ran for Ernest, no longer caring about stealth. The gurgling calls increased in volume and frequency, moving through the trees with impossible speed. I burst onto the road and sprinted for the RV, fumbling with the keys as I ran. I reached the door just as something emerged from the trees on the far side of the road. A tall, elongated silhouette that moved with fluid grace despite its awkward proportions. In the dimming light, I couldn't make out details, only an impression of wrongness that sent primal terror coursing through me. The key slid home. I wrenched the door open, threw myself inside, and slammed it shut behind me, locking it with trembling fingers. Through the windshield, I could see more shapes emerging from the forest. 3, then 5, then too many to count, all with that same wrong silhouette, all moving with that same unnatural smoothness. They didn't approach Ernest directly, but circled at a distance, occasionally emitting those horrible wet sounds. As darkness fell completely, I could see their eyes. Reflective white circles that caught what little ambient light remained, like animals' eyes in headlights, but much larger, much more aware. I huddled in the driver's seat, gripping the bear spray like a talisman, watching as they continued their circular pattern around the RV. Hours passed this way, me inside, them outside, neither advancing nor retreating. Occasionally, one would approach close enough that I could hear a sound like branches scraping against bark, though none actually touched the vehicle. Around midnight, exhaustion overcame terror, and I drifted into a fitful sleep plagued by dreams of being buried alive in earth that whispered with roots and voices. I awoke with a jolt to early morning light and silence. The shapes were gone, the road empty save for Ernest and the surrounding trees that now seemed innocuous in the gentle dawn. Had I imagined it all? The stress, the isolation, the encounters with Harold. Could they have triggered some sort of wilderness psychosis? My relief was short-lived. When I moved to the kitchen area to find water, I saw it. The door I'd so carefully locked hung slightly ajar, a gap of perhaps half an inch visible between door and frame. With mounting dread, I surveyed the RV's interior. The place had been methodically ransacked, drawers pulled out, cupboards emptied, my duffel bag upended on the bed. But most chilling was what had been done to the walls. Every vertical surface inside Ernest was covered with the same message, scratched deeply into the paneling with something sharp. Not their land. Not their land. Not their land. Over and over, hundreds of times, the words carved with such force that in places they went through to the metal beneath. In the center of the small dining table lay the journals and camera I'd so carefully packed in my day pack, the pack that had been beside me in the driver's seat all night. Beside them was a small object I didn't recognize, a figurine, roughly 6 inches tall, made of twisted roots and pine needles bound together with some dark, resinous substance. It was shaped vaguely like a human, but with elongated limbs and a featureless face, save for 2 small reflective stones where eyes should be. I backed away, bile rising in my throat. Whatever had surrounded Ernest in the night hadn't been kept out by locks or walls. They had entered, moved around me as I slept, gone through my possessions, and left this twisted token behind, all without me waking. And they had taken nothing. Not the journals, not the camera, not the evidence I'd collected. They wanted me to have it, wanted me to know. With shaking hands, I gathered the items and shoved them into my day pack. Then I did the only sensible thing left to do. I ran. I abandoned Ernest without a backward glance, the keys still in the ignition. Whatever mechanical issues had stranded him yesterday seemed trivial compared to the horror of what had happened during the night. I struck out walking along the main park road, my pace just short of a jog, driven by the conviction that distance was my only hope. The morning was eerily beautiful, sunlight filtering through golden aspen leaves, the distant mountains sharp against a sky so blue it hurt to look at. Birds sang in the trees, and once a deer crossed the road ahead of me, pausing to regard me with liquid brown eyes before bounding away. The normal wilderness, performing its normal rhythms, as if nothing unnatural lurked among the trees. After an hour of steady walking with no sign of other vehicles, I checked my phone again. Still no service, but the battery was down to 15%. I switched it off to conserve power for a genuine emergency, though what constituted an emergency beyond what I'd already experienced I couldn't imagine. Around noon, the road curved away from the direction I needed to go. According to my map, continuing straight through the woods would save me several miles, cutting across a bend in the road to rejoin it closer to the ranger station. Under normal circumstances, I'd never have considered leaving the relative safety of the road, but fatigue was setting in, and the prospect of shaving hours off my journey was too tempting to resist. I marked my position as best I could, and plunged into the forest, using the sun and my compass to maintain direction. The going was slower than I'd anticipated. Deadfall and thick underbrush forced me to zigzag rather than travel in a straight line. The physical exertion was almost welcome, occupying my mind with immediate concerns rather than the lingering horror of the previous night. The forest grew denser as I walked, the canopy thickening until only occasional shafts of sunlight penetrated to the forest floor. The temperature dropped noticeably in this perpetual shade, and the silence returned. That same watching, waiting absence of sound I'd experienced before. I was considering turning back to the road when I smelled it. Wood smoke, faint but unmistakable on the still air. Smoke meant people, and people meant potential help. I adjusted my course toward the scent, moving as quietly as possible through the underbrush. The trees opened suddenly onto a small clearing, in the center of which stood a cabin. Not a modern vacation home or park service structure, but something far older. Walls of hand-hewn logs darkened by decades of weather, a roof of split shakes covered in moss, small windows with wavy glass that caught the sunlight like water. A thin spiral of smoke rose from a stone chimney, carrying the scent of burning pine. I approached cautiously, scanning for signs of Harold's truck or other dangers. The clearing appeared empty save for the cabin itself and a small woodpile stacked neatly against one wall. No power lines ran to the structure, no satellite dish or antenna broke its rustic silhouette. It looked as if it had grown from the forest floor, a natural formation of wood and stone. As I drew closer, details emerged that sent unease crawling up my spine. The cabin's proportions were subtly wrong. The door slightly too tall and narrow, the windows placed at irregular heights, the whole structure listing slightly to one side as if straining to return to the earth. Most disturbing were the carvings that covered every exposed inch of the exterior walls, intricate patterns of interlocking shapes that, from a distance, resembled decorative knotwork, but up close revealed themselves to be stylized renderings of elongated human figures with antler-like growths emerging from their heads. I was about to retreat when the door opened. An elderly woman stepped onto the small porch, her appearance so startlingly normal after the cabin's wrongness that I froze in place. She was small and bird-like, with silver hair pulled into a neat bun, and a cardigan buttoned over a floral dress despite the wilderness setting. Wire-rimmed glasses perched on a nose that had once been broken and healed slightly crooked. In her hand, she carried a steaming mug that filled the air with the scent of chamomile. She showed no surprise at finding a disheveled stranger standing in her clearing. "Well," she said, her voice warm with a hint of Montana roughness. "Aren't you a sight for sore eyes?" I opened my mouth, closed it, then managed. "I'm sorry to intrude. My RV broke down on the main road and I'm trying to reach the ranger station." "You've wandered a fair piece off course then," she said, smiling. "Come in and warm yourself. You look half frozen and wholly exhausted." Every instinct warned against entering that wrong-proportioned cabin with its disturbing carvings, but the woman herself seemed so ordinary, so grandmotherly, that my fear began to feel absurd. Besides, I was exhausted, hungry, and increasingly desperate for human contact after the isolation and terror of the past 24 hours. "Thank you," I said, climbing the 3 wooden steps to the porch. "I'm Victor Donnelly." "Margaret McAllister," she replied, holding the door open. "But everyone just calls me Maggie." McAllister. The name stopped me in my tracks. Any relation to Harold McAllister? Something flickered behind her eyes. Caution, perhaps, or recognition. "My son," she said after a moment's hesitation. "You've met Harold?" I considered lying, but opted for a partial truth. "Briefly, on the road. He seemed concerned about people camping in certain areas of the park." She sighed, a sound weighted with decades of resignation. "Harold takes after his father in that regard. Too much anger, not enough perspective. Come in. The tea's getting cold." The cabin's interior was as disconcerting as its exterior, though in more subtle ways. The ceiling was unexpectedly high, creating an echo when Maggie spoke. The floorboards were laid at odd angles, forcing my eyes to constantly readjust. The furniture, a table, 2 chairs, a rocking chair by the fireplace, and a narrow bed in one corner, seemed handmade, with the same subtly wrong proportions as the cabin itself. Most of the wall space was occupied by framed photographs, hundreds of them arranged in a dense collage. As Maggie busied herself at a small wood stove, I studied the nearest ones. Many showed a younger Harold with a man who must have been his father. Same wild beard, same intense eyes. Others showed Maggie herself, aging backward through the decades. But the oldest photos, yellowed and fading, showed something that made my skin prickle. A group of stern-faced settlers standing in front of a newly built cabin, this cabin, and behind them, half hidden in shadow, impossibly tall figures with elongated limbs. My family has been here since before this was a national park, Maggie said, startling me. She handed me a chipped mug of tea and gestured toward one of the chairs. 6 generations of McAllisters working the same land. I sat, wrapping my cold fingers around the warm mug. It must have been difficult when the park was established. Her smile tightened almost imperceptibly. The government has always had little regard for those who came before. They drew lines on maps and called it conservation, never mind that we had been conserving this land for a century before they arrived. Your family lost property? Nearly 6,000 acres. Her voice remained pleasant, but something harder entered her eyes. My husband fought them in court for 20 years, died of a heart attack the day the final appeal was denied. I sipped the tea, which tasted of chamomile and something else, something bitter and earthy I couldn't identify. I'm sorry to hear that. It must have been devastating. It was, she agreed, taking the seat opposite me. But the McAllisters are nothing if not adaptable. We found other arrangements. The way she said arrangements sent a ripple of unease through me. I glanced again at the photographs, at those tall, shadowy figures just visible behind the family. Other arrangements? This land has always had its original inhabitants, she said cryptically. Long before settlers, long before the native tribes even. The old ones have been here since the mountains were young. The tea suddenly felt too heavy in my stomach. I set the mug down. The old ones? Her eyes fixed on mine, surprisingly keen behind the glasses. They're particular about their territory, protective, but they can be reasoned with if you understand their ways. A piece clicked into place. Harold's words by the road. They're all yours, like we agreed. You made a deal with them, I said, the words falling from my mouth before I could stop them. Your family, that's how you stayed on the land even after it became a park. Maggie's expression didn't change, but she went very still. You've seen them, haven't you? Not just glimpses like the others. You've really seen them. The air in the cabin seemed to thicken, making it difficult to draw a full breath. Outside, the wind picked up suddenly, whistling through the ill-fitting window frames with a sound like distant voices. I found the campsites, I admitted. Elise Warner, Eric Sullivan, the journals, the camera with the photos. Ah, she nodded slowly. Unfortunate, but not unexpected. Hikers stray into protected areas despite the warnings. Harold tries to turn them back when he can, but some are persistent. Protected areas? My voice rose slightly. Those people were attacked, killed, sacrificed, she corrected gently, as if explaining a simple concept to a child. The arrangement requires payment. The old ones help us keep our land. True ownership, regardless of what government papers say, and in return, they require acknowledgement. Tribute. Horror crawled up my throat. You feed them, people. Only trespassers, she said, still in that reasonable tone. Only those who ignore the signs, who push too far into territories that don't belong to them. Just as the government took what wasn't theirs, these outsiders take what isn't theirs. There's a symmetry to it, don't you think? I stood abruptly, knocking over the chair. The tea was making me dizzy, the edges of my vision darkening. Drugged, I realized too late. The bitter undertaste. I need to go, I managed, my voice sounding distant to my own ears. I'm afraid that's not possible, Maggie said, rising with surprising agility for her age. You've seen too much. Taken evidence. Under normal circumstances, we'd simply let the old ones handle you like the others. But you're different, Victor. You've been marked. Marked? The word felt thick in my mouth. She gestured to my pack. They returned the journals to you. Left their sign. That means they see something in you. Potential, perhaps. The door opened behind me. I turned, already knowing who I would see. Harold filled the doorway, his massive frame blocking the exit. Beyond him, the forest had darkened, though it couldn't be past mid-afternoon. Something about the quality of the shadow suggested gathering clouds, but deeper than any natural storm. "Mother," Harold said, his voice softer than it had been on the road, but no less menacing. "I see you've met our guest." "We've had a lovely chat," Maggie replied. Victor here was just about to make a decision. Harold's eyes locked onto mine. Up close, I could see that what I'd taken for a wild beard was something stranger. Dark tendrils that seemed to move slightly of their own accord, twisting and curling against his skin. His eyes, which I'd thought merely hostile before, had an unnatural reflective quality even in the cabin's dim light. "What decision?" I asked, though I feared I already knew. "Join or feed," Harold said simply. "The old ones have marked you. They offer you a place in the arrangement. Accept, and you remain. Refuse, and you become tribute." "You're insane," I whispered, backing away until I hit the wall of photographs. "Both of you." "We're pragmatists," Maggie corrected. 6 generations on this land, Victor. 6 generations of McAllisters finding a way to survive when the world tried to take everything from us. I looked from her to Harold, seeing the family resemblance more clearly now, not just in their features, but in the fanatical light behind their eyes. They truly believed in what they were doing. Generations of bitterness and isolation had forged a terrible bargain, and they had convinced themselves it was justice. "And if I join?" My mind raced, searching for any way out. "What would that entail?" "You take the mark willingly," Harold said. "Become part of the family. Help maintain the borders, direct trespassers to the tribute areas. In return, you're protected, given a place." "The mark," I repeated. "Like what's happening to you?" His hand rose unconsciously to the writhing tendrils of his beard. "The old ones share a piece of themselves. It changes you, but it extends life. Mother is nearly 90, though you'd never know it." I glanced at Maggie, seeing her seemingly spry 70-year-old appearance in a new, horrifying light. "And if I refuse?" Harold shrugged massive shoulders. "Then we open the door and step aside. The old ones are gathered already. They can sense the mark they left on you, and they're hungry for your answer." As if in response to his words, a low gurgling sound came from just outside the cabin. That same terrible mimicry of human speech I'd heard in the forest. It was answered by another, then another, until the clearing seemed filled with them. "Not much of a choice," I said, playing for time, trying to clear my head from whatever Maggie had put in the tea. "There's always a choice," Maggie said. "That's the point. The government gave us no choice when they took our land. The old ones, at least, offer alternatives." My gaze fell on the photographs again, specifically on one I hadn't noticed before. A faded color Polaroid from perhaps the 1970s showing a young woman with Maggie's features standing beside a man who was clearly Harold at about my age. The date scrawled at the bottom, June 1971. It hit me then. The woman in the photo wasn't Maggie as a young woman. It was her daughter. Harold's wife or sister, perhaps. But if that was Harold in the 1970s... "How old are you?" I asked him directly. A thin smile crossed his face, stretching the tendrils unnaturally. "I was born in 1937. The old ones are generous with those who serve them." Almost 90 years old, and he looked perhaps 60, albeit in poor health. The arrangement he spoke of offered more than land. It offered extended life, at the cost of gradual transformation into something no longer fully human. I need to think, I said, buying more time. Of course, Maggie nodded, but not too long. They grow impatient when tribute is delayed. As if on cue, something heavy thudded against the side of the cabin, making the whole structure shudder. The gurgling voices outside rose in volume and urgency. Harold moved toward me, backing me into a corner. Choose, Mr. Donnelly, now. In desperation, I lunged for my pack, which sat on the floor where I'd dropped it. Harold was faster than his size suggested, grabbing my arm in a grip that felt like iron bands. Mother, he said calmly, open the door. Maggie moved toward the entrance with that same uncanny agility. Outside, the gurgling had reached a fever pitch, accompanied by a sound like dozens of branches being dragged across the cabin walls. In a last, desperate move, I twisted in Harold's grip and plunged my free hand into my jacket pocket, fingers closing around the small canister of bear spray. Before he could react, I brought it up and discharged it directly into his face. The effect was instantaneous and horrifying. Harold released me with a roar that sounded nothing like a human voice. The tendrils around his face writhed wildly, curling away from the spray as if they were separate organisms in pain. His eyes, now clearly reflective like those in Elise's photo, wept a dark fluid that steamed where it hit the floorboards. Maggie turned at the commotion, her face transforming with rage. Beneath the grandmotherly facade, something shifted, her skin rippling as if something moved beneath it, trying to get out. I snatched up my pack and charged toward the door, knocking the smaller woman aside with more force than I intended. She hit the wall with a crack, photographs falling around her. For an instant I saw her face distort, the skin splitting to reveal something dark and glistening beneath. Then I was through the door and into the clearing. What waited outside defied description. Dozens of the tall, wrong-proportioned figures surrounded the cabin, their bodies seeming to shift between solid and shadow as they moved. Up close, I could see that what I'd taken for branches or antlers were actually growths emerging from their elongated heads. Not quite horns, not quite tentacles, but something organic and ancient that twisted toward the sky. They had no faces in any human sense, just smooth, bark-like surfaces interrupted by those reflective eyes and vertical splits that opened to reveal the source of the gurgling sounds. Dark cavities filled with a viscous fluid that vibrated when they spoke. For one frozen moment we regarded each other, me, a terrified human clutching a pack and a mostly empty can of bear spray. Them, ancient beings that had made a devil's bargain with a family bitter enough to sacrifice strangers to maintain their claim on stolen land. Then I ran. I expected pursuit, but when I glanced back after 50 yards, I saw something stranger. The entities were converging on the cabin, ignoring me completely. Through the open door, I could see Harold on his knees, still clutching his face. Maggie stood in the doorway, her form seeming to ripple and distort as she raised her arms toward the approaching figures in what looked like supplication or warning. I didn't wait to see more. I ran as I'd never run before, crashing through underbrush, leaping deadfall, my only thought to put distance between myself and what lurked behind me. The day had darkened further, unnatural shadows deepening beneath the trees, but ahead I could see brighter light. A break in the forest. I burst onto the main park road, nearly colliding with an oncoming Park Service truck. The ranger behind the wheel slammed on the brakes, skidding to a stop inches from where I stood, swaying with exhaustion. "Hey!" she shouted, jumping out. "Are you okay? What are you doing out here without—" She stopped mid-sentence, taking in my wild appearance, the tears in my clothing, the spray canister still clutched in my hand. "Help!" I managed, before my legs gave way and the world went dark. I awoke in a hospital room, the antiseptic smell and steady beep of monitors instantly recognizable. Light streamed through partially closed blinds, casting striped shadows across a standard-issue white blanket. An IV line ran into my arm, and a pulse oximeter glowed red on my finger. For a moment I lay perfectly still, afraid that any movement might reveal this normalcy to be an illusion, a final dream before returning to the horrors of the forest. But the world remained solid. The scratch of hospital sheets against my skin, the distant sounds of a nurse's station, the dull ache in my muscles from running too far too fast. A nurse entered, startling slightly when she saw I was awake. "Mr. Donnelly," she said, approaching the bed. "Good to see you back with us. How are you feeling?" "Thirsty," I managed, my voice a dry rasp. "Where am I?" "Kalispell Regional Medical Center," she said, pouring water from a plastic pitcher. "You were brought in 2 days ago. Severe dehydration, exhaustion, and mild hypothermia. The rangers who found you said you collapsed on the road." 2 days. I'd lost 2 days. "My belongings?" "In the closet," she pointed. "The sheriff's department kept your backpack, though. They said it might be evidence." Evidence. The journals. The camera. Proof of what I'd seen and experienced. "I need to speak with them." "They've been waiting for you to wake up," she assured me. "I'll let them know you're conscious. The doctor will want to check you over first." The next few hours passed in a blur of medical examinations, police interviews, and trying to sort reality from nightmare. The doctor pronounced me physically sound apart from exhaustion and dehydration. The sheriff's deputy who took my statement was professional, but clearly skeptical as I recounted my experiences, editing out the more supernatural elements but emphasizing the missing hikers, the ransacked campsites, and the threatening behavior of Harold McAllister. "We're familiar with McAllister," the deputy said, making notes. "He's had run-ins with the Park Service before. Trespassing, harassment of campers, illegal hunting. Never anything violent, though." "Did you find the cabin?" I asked. "Or them?" He looked up, frowning slightly. "We searched the area based on your description. Found your RV where you said it would be, engine blown. The interior was vandalized just like you described. But there was no cabin in that vicinity, Mr. Donnelly. No structures of any kind within 5 miles. "That's impossible," I insisted. "I was there. I spoke with them. It was—" "You were severely dehydrated," he interrupted gently. "Possibly experiencing hallucinations. The search teams found no evidence of a cabin or residence in that section of the park." "What about the backpack? The journals? The camera?" "We're analyzing those now," he said. "They do belong to individuals reported missing in the park, Eric Sullivan and Elise Warner. Their families have been notified that we've recovered some of their belongings." "And the bodies?" The deputy's expression tightened. "No remains have been recovered. We're expanding the search area based on the last known coordinates from Ms. Warner's journal." After he left, I lay staring at the ceiling, trying to reconcile what I knew with what others were willing to believe. The missing hikers were real. The vandalized RV was real. The backpack, journals, and camera were real. But the cabin that vanished between one day and the next, the ancient entities that had made a bargain with a family willing to sacrifice strangers to maintain their claim, the human but not quite human McAllisters, gradually transforming into something else entirely, those would be dismissed as the hallucinations of an exhausted, dehydrated mind. I wasn't sure I could blame them. I was released from the hospital the following day. The sheriff's department arranged temporary accommodations in Kalispell while their investigation continued, advising me not to leave the area. I spent the first day sleeping, my body still recovering from the ordeal. The second day, I began my own investigation. The public library in Kalispell was small but surprisingly well stocked with local history materials. I started with newspaper archives, searching for anything related to the McAllister family or strange occurrences in that section of Glacier National Park. What I found chilled me more deeply than the entities in the forest ever had. The McAllisters were real, a family that had settled in the area in the 1870s, establishing a homestead that eventually grew to nearly 6,000 acres. When the land was incorporated into Glacier National Park in the early 1900s, The family had indeed fought the designation through legal challenges, protests, and eventually threats against park officials. But that's where reality diverged from what I'd been told in the cabin. According to newspaper accounts from 1943, the last known McAllister, Harold Sr., had disappeared during a blizzard after threatening a park ranger. The official report concluded he had become disoriented in the storm and perished, though his body was never recovered. Subsequent articles documented a bizarre series of vanishings in the decades that followed. Hikers, campers, and occasionally park employees, all disappearing without trace from the same general area of the park. The disappearances followed no discernible pattern except geography and an odd seasonality. They happened exclusively between April and October, when the area was accessible by foot. Most disturbing was what I found in a local history book published in the 1960s. A grainy black and white photograph showed the original McAllister homestead, a cabin with the exact same wrong proportions I'd seen, the same too-tall door and irregular windows. The caption noted that the structure had burned to the ground in 1944, barely a year after Harold Sr.'s disappearance. If the cabin had been destroyed 8 decades ago, what had I seen in the forest? I expanded my search, digging into local legends and folklore. In a slim volume of regional myths, I found a single paragraph that made my blood freeze. Native tribes in the region avoided certain valleys within what is now Glacier National Park, believing them to be inhabited by the tall people, ancient spirits that were neither human nor animal, but something that existed before both. These entities were said to claim humans who trespassed in their territory, gradually transforming them into creatures like themselves over many generations. According to legend, certain families made pacts with the tall people, offering sacrifices in exchange for protection and extended life. The book contained no further information, dismissing the legend as a typical tribal superstition meant to keep people away from dangerous terrain. But I knew better. That evening, I received a call from the sheriff's department. The deputy I'd spoken with at the hospital wanted to meet me the following morning to discuss new developments in the investigation. He refused to elaborate further over the phone. I barely slept that night, my dreams filled with glimpses of elongated figures moving through trees and Harold's face as the tendrils twisted in pain from the bear spray. The next morning, I arrived at the sheriff's department to find not just the deputy, but a full conference room of people, park rangers, FBI agents, and a woman introduced as Dr. Eleanor Marsh from the University of Montana's Anthropology Department. "Mr. Donnelly," the deputy began, "we owe you an apology. We should have taken your account more seriously from the start." "You found the cabin," I said, not a question. The deputy exchanged glances with one of the FBI agents. "Not exactly, but we found something. The forensic team analyzing the camera you recovered managed to extract additional images beyond the ones you saw. Some were corrupted, but what was visible corroborates elements of your story." Dr. Marsh slid a folder across the table. "The journal entries also contained information that aligns with local indigenous legends I've been studying for years. Accounts of the entities you described appear in tribal records dating back centuries." I opened the folder to find printouts of the camera images, enhanced and clarified. They showed exactly what I'd seen in the forest, the 2 tall figures with their elongated limbs and reflective eyes. More disturbing were close-ups of what appeared to be partial transformations, human hands developing bark-like textures, human faces with tendrils emerging from beneath the skin. "There's more," the park ranger said. "We've used ground-penetrating radar in the area where you indicated the cabin stood. While there's no structure there now, we found evidence of foundations and a mass grave containing at least 12 sets of human remains. Some dating back decades," the FBI agent added. "Preliminary findings suggest the most recent dates to approximately 3 weeks ago." "Elise Warner," I said quietly. "Most likely," the agent nodded. "We're conducting DNA tests to confirm." "And Harold? Maggie?" Have you found them? The room went silent for a moment before the deputy spoke again. That's where things get complicated. According to all official records, the McAllister family line ended in 1943. There is no Harold Jr. or Margaret McAllister. But I saw them, I insisted. I spoke with them. We believe you, Dr. Marsh said, leaning forward. The indigenous legends speak of humans who made pacts with these entities, the tall people, as they called them. Those who made these bargains were said to take on characteristics of the entities over time, gaining extended life but gradually transforming into something no longer human. The legends also mention that these collaborators could move between worlds, one of the park rangers added. That they existed in a space between our reality and whatever realm the tall people inhabited. They could be visible or invisible at will. Structures could appear or disappear. I thought of the cabin that existed in one moment and vanished in the next, of Harold's impossible age, of Maggie's skin rippling to reveal something else beneath. So, what happens now? I asked. The FBI is taking over the investigation, the deputy said. The disappearances cross state lines and span decades. They're treating it as a serial murder case, though how to classify the perpetrators is problematic. We may never find them, the FBI agent admitted. If the legends have any basis in fact, these individuals can simply step sideways, for lack of a better term, become unreachable. But we can protect others, the park ranger added firmly. The area has been closed to all visitors pending the investigation. We're installing camera systems and monitoring equipment throughout the region. Dr. Marsh caught my eye. Mr. Donnelly, you're the first person to encounter these entities and their human collaborators and return to tell about it coherently. Your account is invaluable. I'd like to work with you to document everything you experienced, if you're willing. I agreed, of course. The following weeks were consumed with formal statements, hypnotherapy sessions to recover details I might have suppressed, and endless debriefings with various agencies. Dr. Marsh and I compiled a comprehensive record of my experiences, cross-referenced with historical accounts and indigenous legends. The result was a classified report that would never see public light, but might help prevent future disappearances. 4 months after my ordeal, I received permission to return to Seattle. My former publishing company, hearing vague rumors of my heroic survival in the wilderness, offered me my position back. I declined. Instead, I used the modest settlement from the National Park Service, offered in exchange for a non-disclosure agreement about certain aspects of the investigation, to rent a small apartment in Monterey, California, as far from the forests of Montana as I could reasonably get while remaining on the West Coast. I thought it was over. I wanted it to be over. Then, exactly 1 year after my escape from the cabin, a package arrived at my apartment. No return address, no postmark, as if it had been hand-delivered. Inside was a small object that stopped my breath. A figurine made of twisted roots and pine needles bound with dark resin, shaped like a human but with elongated limbs and reflective stones for eyes. Identical to the one left in my RV that night. Wrapped around it was a note written in spidery handwriting. The old ones don't forget those they've marked, Mr. Donnelly. Neither do we. The arrangement continues, with or without your participation. Should you reconsider our offer, return to the clearing when the leaves turn. We'll be waiting. We have all the time in the world. M. McAllister. I burned the figurine and the note that night, watching the flames consume them on my small balcony overlooking the Pacific. As they turned to ash, I could have sworn I heard a familiar sound beneath the crackle of the fire, a wet, gurgling vocalization that mimicked human speech without understanding it. The ocean breeze eventually carried the ashes away, but I know with terrible certainty that the mark remains. Sometimes in the mirror, I catch a glimpse of something moving beneath my skin, just for an instant. And at night, when the darkness is complete, My eyes sometimes reflect light in ways they shouldn't. Perfect white circles staring back at me from the glass. I never returned to Glacier National Park. I never will. But I know the arrangement continues. Humans sacrifice to ancient entities in exchange for extended life and power. And I know that somewhere in those mountains, in a cabin that exists in the spaces between our world and theirs, Harold and Maggie McAllister are still waiting, still watching, still keeping their terrible bargain. And sometimes, on cold nights when the wind sounds like voices, I wonder how long I can outrun what was offered to me in that clearing, and what I might become if I ever stop running.